Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors podcast. I'm Kevin James, and this is my co-host, Neil Thomas.
Thank you, Kevin. The Improvisers podcast is about improvisation for improvisers by improvisers.
Neil and I have been relishing the opportunity to chat with improvisers about their practice, past, present, and potentially future.
And today it gives us great pleasure to be talking with the legend, Andrew Morrish.
Great.
Welcome, Andrew Morrish. It's been a build-up. We are so thrilled to be talking with you today. Long-time friend of ours, and a man so full that we're thrilled to have you on.
Andrew, I wanted to lead off by mentioning the Facebook site, Wunder and Andrew Morrish are improvising gods.
Quite rightly too.
To confirm that, it needs to be mentioned here.
Yes.
We could possibly maybe add Peter Trotman in as well, but
he's more an archangel, I think.
But I mentioned that to just acknowledge the significance, Andrew, of course, that you have played in the development of improvisation in Melbourne right through Australia, because I know you've taught in all of the capitals in Europe, and the impact that you've had on improvisation taking on the form that it has and becoming increasingly more is so much down to you, your teaching, your conceptualizing, and I think your energized and committed approach to improvisation. It's had a major impact. So on behalf of us all, thank you.
Well, Kevin, if I'd known, I would have tried harder. But yes, who knows what people's perspective is on what you do, but internally here, it's just been a matter of following a trail and staying engaged, and these things are in the end quite simple. And if you add to that the need to make a living, then I suppose the things you're talking about have to happen. So yes, it's partly mercenary on my part, I think, to claim status. I certainly would like to acknowledge Wunder, who's about to turn 80, which is remarkable in itself, still playing table tennis. But his role in that, I've always acknowledged. I wouldn't have found improvisation without Wunder. I would never have imagined about improvisation without Wunder. Wunder set the scene, brought the milieu to me, and I was actually looking at his book recently, and he wrote in the beginning. I wrote the introduction, which is quite possibly the best part of the book. But he wrote at the beginning here, when he gave me this copy, he said, "Hey, Drew, here's a book or two for you. They say good things come in twos. Of course, it comes in threes and many and many's. And then there's you, the one who understood my teaching even more than I did myself." And I think all that means is I actually believed him. and I think about that a lot in my own teaching, that sometimes I worry that people might be believing what I'm saying. It's a terrible responsibility to imagine what you're saying is true, and that people might believe it, endorse it. When you're teaching, then you want them to believe it in the workshop, but then you want them to, when they go ahead of the workshop, to kind of engage with the real world and to question and to challenge some of the things in the workshop. Go with it, submerge yourself. But I know Al presented me with a world, and I think about that early generation of students and how many and how few of people stuck with improvisation from that. There's Peter Trotman, of course, the dark prince of improvisational spirit. He and I both started about the same time. I would like to talk a bit about my history, Kevin. I thought you'd ask me that question. Can I slip seamlessly into that of my own accord?
Go forth.
Good, thank you, and multiply. And I've kind of broken all my rules today. I've actually done preparation, and I consider that to be a sin as an improviser. So this is probably going to go very badly. I went deep into my archive and I could find very little. I found this poster up here, Peter and me performing at the Green Mill in 1994, our first series for them in what was the first first screen mill, I think so. Dance and narrative was a thing. And we called it the Trail of Crumbs, a series of 5 lunchtime performances. We did that. But I've also found some other things in the archive, and I'd like to share some of those with you as a quick kind of summary of how I got here. And number one is this. This is a Theatre of the Ordinary t-shirt, around 1986, something like that, I think. What's interesting in that, well, why would I say it's Theatre of the Ordinary Improvisation Theatre t-shirt? It would imply that you can't read, but anyway. But the thing that's interesting, this is Lynn Santos here, and then a little mangled image of her. This is Jill Shaw, and a little mangled image of her. This is David Wells, and a very mangled image of him. This is Peter Trotman with his mangled image. There's Andrew Morrish, complete with YMCA moustache, and their mangled image of me. And this is Lyndon Nichols there, and down here is the ever handsome Al Wunder. And that was Theatre of the Improvisation in that 86, 87, 88. There was a kind of interview with Lyndon in this Writings on Dance #3, which was published in 1988, about the work of Theatre of the Ordinary, because it was an amazing time for me. It was when I found the company. Al, he formed the company. I was in it. Peter and I were both original members. Then they added people. Some people came and went. But this was kind of a core group towards the end of its life. I started working with Al 5 years before that. We were doing shows. Everybody all did workshops with Al as well as company training. So it was kind of as close as I got to actual training in improvisation. I walked into it and found a home immediately after standing on the edges of dance for 3 or 4 years before that, going to dance classes and finding that I couldn't find the dancing in them. I found a lot of things I couldn't do, but I couldn't find space for dancing. So for me, it was quite a revelation, and also at this point, primarily a hobby. You know, there was no way I imagined I would make a living from something called improvisation. I did it because I loved it. Al was a teacher in Melbourne. Why would you teach when people could go to Al Wunder? Why would you possibly even think about teaching? So it was kind of like my hobby. I was fully engaged working in disability and dance, and having a great time with that. So it didn't occur to me that this would turn into anything else. The next t-shirt I found, 1995. This is IFNI, Improvisation Festival, New York. Peter and I went there in 1995 and again in 1997. 1995, we got to perform at Judson's Church, which is hallowed turf, the MCG of improvisation, I call it. And in 1997, we got to perform at St. Mark's Church in the Lower East Side there of New York. That kind of marks the beginning of Peter and I kind of working more widely than just in Melbourne. We taught a bit. We had our seasons. We both left the company about 1987, 1988. And we kept working together. So this was kind of like really when the work became ours, and the working method, basically we did research in the studio, pushing each other with ideas, and then we performed together. And that pretty much lasted from the end of Theatre of the Ordinary to 1999. We did not a lot, but we did some overseas things. We went to New York Improvisation Festival twice. The second time we went, we also did some performing at a chord conference which I think we did twice, maybe once or twice. We certainly performed at the one in Florida, the Congress on Resurgent Dance in the United States. We, over this time and the next few years, we also performed a bit more Sydney and Perth, and that was kind of, we were kind of out there bigger than we'd ever been before. The Green Mill thing that I talked up there in 1994, that kind of was a breakthrough, because we got a review from that in the Village Voice, which is kind of why we followed up by going to New York. And that was the first review we ever had. So kind of, we thought, well, there's nowhere to go with the reviews after that. They said I was endearingly light on my feet in the review. So that became a slogan for the rest of my life. Peter was merely mustachioed. I let him wear that as he wants. Mustaches are like that. The next T-shirt is Relentlessly On. This is a season, or a number of seasons I performed in around 2000, 2001. I'd moved to Sydney in 1999 to be with Ross Crisp, the world's second best choreographer. And so Relentlessly On was a season that we did at the performance space in Sydney. Then I was kind of initiating these performance seasons, combining Tony Osborne from Sydney and Peter from Melbourne, and we would do seasons at performance space. Sometimes Peter couldn't make it, it would just be Tony and me. There were about 3 or 4 of those around this time. They were all around long solos. When I stopped working with Peter in 1999, we had our duet form based really around re-entering narratives, I would call that, which was really what Peter's conceptual work was all about. And I was just kind of an ally in that, in a way. And then I stopped working with him and did focus more on solo. So Relentlessly On was usually a combination of 2 or 3 solos. If there were 2 of us, they'd be half an hour each, and if there was 3 of us, they'd be 20 minutes each. And then I was also trying to do them on my own. I did a season of this Powerhouse in Brisbane. So by now I was really focused on the solo and finding ways to perform that and teaching that. And around this time is when I first started. Ros was going to Europe semi-regularly, so I went to Europe to be with her, and then I gradually began to get invitations to do teaching over there, also especially in Berlin, connecting with the improv scene there, and they're performing in that thing as well. And that kind of marks quite a shift to me into the solo, away from the duet work with Peter. The next T-shirt, this is the Andrew Morrish Solo World Tour. I know you can read. Don't you worry about that. I don't need to tell you what it is, but it's a spurious world tour. I just put on a T-shirt all the performances I did in that period. And luckily I've got it here. You probably can't read that. I call them all lying, stealing, and cheating. The 3 fundamental laws of improvisation, I used to say in my teaching. Also a rip-off of an album by Bang on the Can, the fantastic percussion group from New York. It's got Amsterdam, Berlin, Brisbane, Campbelltown, Göteborg, Huddersfield, Kaya, London, Melbourne, Munich, Paris, Vienna, Viandi, Estonia, and Zurich in Switzerland. And now I'm really deeply in this whole European thing, a life which is about teaching and performing improvisation. That's it. That was my professional life. It had become my single focus by now. I was making a living out of it. I made a living out of that lifestyle for over 20 years. What is it? A year after this T-shirt came out, I had a heart attack and a quadruple bypass. So it wasn't completely straightforward, but I did love that way of living. And amazing to be in Europe and see that the kind of potential for that is there's a mass of it. There's a whole community of things there. Every community feels isolated in improvisation. That's one of the rules. Everybody feels isolated. No one knows what we're doing. You know, there's no scene, but actually there's a massive scene, but everybody's isolated. So they all think they're on their own. And for 20 years, I never did any advertising. In terms of promoting myself, I got invitations to go to places, or people do workshops and they say, can you come here and do it there? And I would go, yes. I never did any of that, you know, cold calling, selling kind of thing. It was really wonderful. And in combination with Roz's work in Europe and being a support to her in that, it was really a very wonderful, wonderful phase. And really it wasn't until COVID that stopped, and that's interesting too. I think that's the end of the T-shirts. Is that 4? Anyone listening?
Yep.
Anyone paying attention?
Yep, that's 4.
Yes, that's good.
Good.
Very good. A life in 4 T-shirts. I'll let come back to me now. There we are.
Great.
What's your comment on the preparation so far, Neil? Is it going well?
I think it's wonderful. I think it's concise. It's visual. and you know, it's contemporary. The T-shirt, it's brilliant. I think
Exactly.
it's bringing improvisation into the world of rock and roll.
Exactly.
So,
Buy a T-shirt.
yeah. I'd just like to pick up a thread that sparked my interest, and maybe that could lead into some sort of ramblings around coaching and teaching, because that has been a big part of your life. But the idea of lying, stealing, and cheating, maybe unpack that a little bit in
Yes. Yes. Yeah, the teaching side of what I always remember Al at a certain point saying he thought he himself was more a teacher than a performer at a certain point in his career. I remember him having that clear as an idea, and I do love both of those things, but I suspect if I lived in some kind of totalitarian state where they say, well, you can't be two things, you just got to be one, then I would go, well, I'm a teacher then, you know. But it's like 51-49. It's like they're very closely related for me, and my teaching style is very performative, and people, you could say that my performing is a bit pedagogical too, I suppose. But yes, and you know, during that 20 odd years in Europe, 90% of my income was from teaching and 10% from performing. I always said it's easier for me to get 10 people to give me €100 to do a workshop than it is to get 100 people to give me €10 to watch me perform. And that's nothing about anything apart from the fact that maybe I'm a better teacher than I am a performer. But it's for me, the distinction between them, the last 15 years or so, it's nearly always in these kind of situations, you end up talking and then somebody asks you a question and then you give the answer, which is the one that you've been teaching. And I've tried more and more to kind of be clear about whether I'm speaking as a teacher or whether I'm speaking as a performer, because me as an artist is much more an individual thing and not really generalizable to anyone else, whereas the teaching is all about the generalizable information, and neither of them are the full truth in all of that. So yes, but it was the key to sustainability, the teaching, and I did love it. You know, I do love it, always have loved it. Since COVID, I've turned away from teaching. I do tiny bits every now and then, but I do a lot more individual coaching with people I know, and that's been really sustainable too, because of the possibility of doing that online, whereas running a workshop online doesn't attract me at all. So that's kind of pragmatic, really. And I've forgotten the other half of that question now, Neil. Can you come back to that?
Lying, stealing, and cheating.
Yes.
How does that?
Yes. Yes. Well, it's such a love. When I'm in Europe, I say in Australia, this is how I describe improvisation, because they're all criminals down there anyway. So lying is just making stuff up, isn't it? Stealing is being inspired by what other people do, and cheating is making things work for you. So as a teacher, I give people a task, and they go, oh, that's not very interesting, but this is more interesting. You know, technically they're cheating. They're not doing the thing I said, but they're making it's about turning things into things that work for you. And so it's nicely larrikin sounding, lying, stealing, and cheating, but actually there are substantive things in that actually do say something about improvisation, about creativity, letting yourself be inspired, and imagination. So I that was a good 10-minute bit every workshop I ever did. It was fantastic. I got really good at that. But it's kind of semi-ironic, and but at the same time, there's something underneath there that's worth saying. The whole teaching theme, I've talked a lot about this as I kind of developed this kind of idea of dimensions. So there's a one-dimensional two and a one-dimensional thing, which is about one thing. So they're the teachers who say, this is the most important thing. This one thing you've got to get this one thing right. That's one-dimensional teaching. Nothing wrong with that. There's two-dimensional teaching, which is you have to work out how you get from here to there and backwards and forwards between two things. And then there's three-dimensional teaching, which is almost impossible, which is everything It's all around you. It's, you know, it takes it into a kind of much more amorphous kind of, you know, sloganeering in a way, you know, a bit more religious when you start talking about those sorts of things. So as a teacher, what you tend to do is reduce the totality of the thing, which in improvisation is something I would call being human, you know, and the complex and subtle interconnections and pattern making that we all have inside us. That's what improvisation is about, but you can't teach that because everybody's in the middle of it. You know, they can't get on the outside of it. So what you do is you reduce it to one-dimensional things and two-dimensional things so that there's a bit of clarity and a bit of particular focus. So most teaching is one-dimensional and two-dimensional. And but you are teaching the three-dimensional thing, which you basically can't teach. You know, it can't be reduced to tasks, activities, rules, any of those things. Whereas one-dimensional and two-dimensional, a one-dimensional thing, you go, you're doing that wrong. You can easily say that, you know, so there's right and wrong, really, really handy. In improvisation, right and wrong is much less relevant. The whole thing that matters is that you're learning ways that are generative, that produce things that surprise you. And that's where two-dimensional is really good, because you interact between two things, then the outcome might be surprising. But if I give you a task and you just go, okay, I'm going to do this task. Some people are very, very concrete about that, depending on the kind of training they've had. So some people go, you do that task, then they will just stick to the task and they will just work at it and work at it and work at it. And they end up with a very particular skill in doing that thing, but it's actually not very generative. So what you're always looking for is what you give people with sufficient kind of looseness so that it becomes a generative thing. So I say this in my teaching too, that when you're working in improvisation, everything you do has at least two functions, two-dimensional. Number one is to be interesting to be doing when you're doing it. That's its number one function. So whatever task I give you, your job is to find a way to be interested in it. And its other function is to lead you to the next thing that might be interesting. So it's got to kind of have this porous end. And if you hold too tight to a skill, then you're losing its generative potential. So therefore, you're always looking to slide out into something else, or noticing that in your attempt to stick with something, some new thing comes in to help it be interesting. And then you go, oh, that's the new thing. I'll go with that now. Those kind of things. So that way of thinking, one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional. I mean, people often assume that surely it's better to be three-dimensional, and I go, no, there's no hierarchy there. It's just an approach. So be as one-dimensional as you want when you really want to get good at skill. Practice it and practice it and practice it. Be as two-dimensional as you want when you want to kind of really learn about this generative things, let things rub up against each other and produce a spark. And you, in the end, when you perform, what you want is to be as three-dimensional as you can, not be thinking about your tools, not be thinking about the skills, not be thinking about the process, but just kind of letting who you are unfold through the matrix of the way you've learned to do that. That's what's precious about improvisation for me, is in the end, you see a subtle, complex, nuanced human being finding their way through the material, you know, which is really, you know, now we've got, oh, that's life. People constantly in my workshops say, you're teaching me about life, aren't you? And I go, well, you'll find that's a lot more expensive. I can teach you about art very cheap, but if you're going to get life skills, I'm going to cost you a lot more. So just stick to the art, I think, because, yeah. So anyway, that's kind of what's got me been kind of occupying my thinking for the last few years, of just understanding that the job of a teacher is essentially reductive. You've got to break things down so that people can go, I can do that. Because the thing that you actually want them to do, you can't do it because you tell someone to do it. You know, go out and be yourself. And people just go, I don't know how to do that. You know, I need something concrete that I can do. And my years in early childhood, I think, gave me a deep belief in concrete, in giving people tasks they can do rather than selling them a kind of almost mystical kind of concept. You know, say, well, do this and see what happens, talk about it. Do this, see what happens, talk about it. I'll wonder, talk about what you enjoyed, only talk about what you enjoyed. And gradually over time, they learn to trust more and more themselves. And, then they get that wonderful combination of when trust and risk work together. Because they can trust something, therefore they can afford to take a risk because there's somewhere trustworthy to go return to if it's a disaster, all of that stuff.
Andrew, I just want to confirm a couple of things. One is, having done many workshops, particularly earlier with you when we were bringing you up to Brisbane, there was always something, I think you've just articulated your teaching beautifully in its essence. There was always something about how you could give specific tasks, and yet it would be up to us, as us being the participants in workshops, to make what we might make of them and to actually build our practices around. So it was very invitational to actually participate, but then reflect and build our practices based on what interested us and what we found in the process of participation. And I think you've done a lot to consolidate improvisation around a practice as an art form. And I'd love you to wander off into this area a little, if you would.
Yeah, thanks for all of that, Kevin. I appreciate it very much. Al used to say, you become your own teacher. That's one of those things that, the kind of thing I was just talking about. Like, he would say that, and I would go, I don't know what you mean by that, Al. What, can I go off and just be my own teacher? No, I can't. I don't know what to do. So, I still needed him at that point, and I never say that, it's like one of those things where that idea, it emerges from the experience of doing it. I do want people to become their own artists. I don't want them to become dependent on me in my workshops. I like them to come back every now and then. I like to eat. But what I'm trying to do, and I think Al was like this too, encouraging people to develop their own practice. Like, that's something you can do. So I talk about that. Keep working when you're not in a workshop. Like, improvisation just doesn't happen when you're in a workshop with Andrew Morrish, and the rest of your life is some kind of desert in that way. So all of those things, really did matter to me. But I would never say become your own teacher. Because it's too metaphysical in a way, whereas keep practicing is something which you can do. And I knew that from when Peter and I left Al. It was great to work with him and to discover the milieu, and I'm endlessly grateful for what he gave us. But really, our work started when we used to go to the studio together twice a week, 48 weeks of the year, which we did for a decade and a half. And that's where we found our own kind of methodology, if you like, and I think that's what I always considered to be the indicator of success. If I could encourage people to have practice in improvisation, if people want to come and have a workshop, I could pretty much guarantee they'd have a good time. And I'd go, that's a fair enough contract. If they come, they give me the money, they enjoy themselves. But the hallmark of success for me was how many of these people will actually end up with an improvisation practice that goes beyond the workshop. And I'd say it's about 30% success at that rate. Most people came and did workshops. Some people, they come and do a workshop, they would be great, then they go away and they do nothing and come back and do another workshop 2 years later, and I'd happily take their money and I'd happily teach them. But it's like, the real point is keep going. And that's because it is an art form, and all art forms require commitment. They don't. None of them exist from a single point in a practice. They all actually emerge from continual practice. And I used to, that thing you said there. This kind of way of thinking started around 2012 when I had my heart attack, and I realized all I'd done up until then, from 1981 or whatever it was when I started with Al until 2012, that basically I'd taken from improvisation. I'd taken its many, many gifts. And then suddenly I thought, and this is a kind of almost embarrassing cliche, but, I should give something back, So I thought, it's like improvisation had made me look clever. I was thinking, that's interesting, isn't it? It's given me, people go, oh, he's a good improviser, or he's a good improvisation teacher, one of those two things. So it was like it'd given me things. and I'd contributed anything new or anything substantial back to it by what I'd done, and the answer I felt was no. I'd just kind of done what I needed to do, really pragmatic. So then this whole idea, what if, what special properties of art would you expect to get from a thing called improvisation? What if it is an art form in its own right, not something to be used as a tool in support of another art form? So that's how it generally has been used in the performing arts. You improvise to generate content. That's a good bit of content. We'll collect through that process, a whole lot of good bits, and then we'll put them together in a show, and then, we'll be successful and we will be rich. And that was so it was used, and I just love that, how ambiguous that term is. I feel used is a negative, whereas I used improvisation, somehow people seem to feel that was okay. And watching in dance, for instance, how many times I've been to mediocre dancing with very good music, and you go, they're using that music to make the dancing look better. And it's kind of like, if I was a musician, I'd be a bit offended by that. You go, no, that's not what music's for, just to make your dancing look better. The music's got its own life. It's got its own integrity, if you like. So let's take the position that improvisation is an art form, and then let's start thinking about, well, what does that mean about the kind of art you might expect to make from a thing called improvisation, which means you have not sat down and carefully considered the content, and you have not carefully organized it in the right order to create the right effect, any of those things. And that was really inspiring for me for a long time, in terms of clarification. A lot of people would say, oh, my improvisations don't make sense. And I go, and, why would you expect a form that's about you following a particular kind of way your process, an associative way that your brain works, will do something called make sense in any kind of logical way? Why would you expect that? Sometimes it will, because your brain can work that way, and sometimes it won't. And if you only value the ones that make sense in that particular logic kind of path, then you're going to be disappointed a lot, and you're going to end up making work because you want to be in control of that path. And that's fair enough. There is a very noble a set of professions about writing, making work, making theatre, all of those things. Go and do that. And by all means, use improvisation in that process. But improvisation itself will not guarantee those outcomes. Therefore, you are doomed to be disappointed a lot. And the other thing is, you're not being respectful to this thing called improvisation. So improvisation, by me, dramaturgically, it's got every right to be lumpy. It's got every right to be inelegant in its form. It's got every right to have dead ends. It's got every right to have all those things that a dramaturgist would want to get rid of. And I think that's to take that on board and go, yep, that's what I do. I release myself into that. You release all of yourself into that. That's the other thing that needs to be said. So we all have a need to satisfy ourselves as a craftsperson. So you are allowed to craft them as much as you want. I prefer to imagine you craft them within the spirit of improvisation, not by planning the structure before, but by seeing what is the emergent structure, what are the emergent scores, what is the emergent form, and riding that in some way. So having a bit of your brain available to notice some of that, and they go, oh, I need to change the energy. So you change the energy. That's great. So it's not like you can't do any dramaturgy, but it's like, for me, it's emergent dramaturgical information, etc. I could go on for a long time on that thing, but that thing about having a bit more respect for it as a form, and everybody in every artistic form feels some, as I said before, isolated in some way. And in improvisation, most people say we don't get enough recognition. And well, maybe we have to start, but not start from the position, I'm a really good improviser. Why does nobody recognize that? But actually start by going, I, the artist, value improvisation as an art form, and therefore I'm trying to deal with it in a way which is respectful to its intention. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm actually a theatre maker or a musician or a choreographer, and I'm using improvisation as a set of tools. Great, no problem with that. But I do think to advocate on its behalf as an art form is kind of in my own kind of gentle way, my mission these days to kind of just keep reinforcing that idea that it is open to be the unfolding of what it is, where your attention goes. And I thought about that too. You know, every art form has its virtuosity. So, you know, in dance, the virtuosity is about movement and organizing movement, choreographically speaking. In music, it's about sound and how you organize the sound. You know, so to be a dancer in the kind of Western capitalist societies, there's a certain way of moving that's required. You go, I'm a dancer because I've got this kind of professional badge and all of that stuff. You know, and I would say the prime virtuosity for improvisation is working with your attention. That noticing is the thing we are best at, and we should be noticing, you know, all the big sparky dynamic sensations in the body, you know, but we should also be able to notice the shadows and the nuances and all of that. That's what we're really, really good at. That's what we should be really good at. That's what we are training ourselves to be good at, working from our attention as much as possible. What am I noticing? And, you know, being able to articulate the kind of realms of that, I think, is an important thing for teachers.
I was, thank you, Andrew. I was thinking to ask you to talk a little bit more around the idea of releasing all of yourself into an improvisation. And I mean, we've talked about this before a little bit. I think in these times when it feels like what can be said is shrinking. I don't know, temporarily, or I don't know. Sometimes I wonder about that. But I think as an improviser, what happens if you're offensive? Is there a sense of needing to kind of edit material? Talk about how you can release yourself completely on stage.
Yeah.
And the consequences of that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I don't think you can release yourself totally on stage. I'm in wonder, Al, that's a reference to you in case you didn't notice. I'm in wonder of the fact that I've been performing for 40 odd years and I've never once had a shit on stage. You know, so am I totally free? Have I ever needed a shit on stage? Quite possibly. But have I ever once thought to myself, you know what, now you should have a shit? It's never occurred me. Once I did pretend to piss on a wall in Carriage Works. They had this heritage wall that you weren't allowed to touch. I was performing, so I walked up and pretended to piss on it, but I didn't actually do it. You know, and so you go, well, no, of course not. We are not totally free, and we never will be totally free. Our wonderful, wonderful friend gravity sees to that. So you know. So it's not about total freedom, but it's about being able to feel that you are inhabiting yourself. Now, we've all got unworthy thoughts inside us. I mean, human beings, I think, are innately racist, you know, innately fear that which is different. And that's why as societies, we can never relax about those things. And we must, you know, it's never going to stop being necessary to go, racism is bad, and doing things about it when it begins to emerge, because it's just innate in human. It's part of this, you know, the immune system is about recognizing that which is not you and then destroying it. And that's kind of deep in what it means to be human. So yes, I would love to have gone through life without offending people, but I have offended people. And what used to happen is they just didn't come back. They never told me. They never said that's offensive. They just didn't come back. So it's self-selecting in those days. And as you rightly point out, we now live in a time when there's more virulence around all of that. So you can get this thing called cancelled because you say something that people, you know, that reflects that your values are actually 20 years out of date. And you go, okay, the world's changing. I have to do my best to stay up with all of that. But I don't experience that as censorship for myself. I have no desire to offend people, even though I know I have offended people. Some people want to offend, and and I've always considered that to be absolutely acceptable, but I don't waste my time going to see those people, because I go, well, it's just adolescent, that is, it's hard enough. You just go and talk to an adolescent, if you want to be with adolescents, but don't turn it into an art form. Be interested in adolescent art forms, be interested in mature art forms. So it's delicate, but I wouldn't call it what happens to me under those circumstances is censorship. We will make mistakes. We will go too far. I have this joke I share with my 90-year-old mother-in-law, which is, she said to me one day, "You never know you've gone too far until you've gone too far." She was talking about gardening, but that's a constant thing I do as a performer. I go too far. If I say 3 really great things, so I'll add a 4th and it's not as good, and you go, oh, you've gone too far again. So it's a constant artistic dilemma about going too far. And up until the moment you've gone too far, everything's perfect. And then you've gone too far and there is often nowhere back. You are then falling in free air. And as an improviser, you then have to deal with that in some way, So I just think it's part of the dynamic. I think it's always been there. I think the whole issue of representation is fraught and has been since the, feminism. So as a man, can I ever speak on behalf of a woman? Can I present a woman's view? The answer to those 2 things is clearly no. And now all these other categories that I can't speak on behalf of in Australia, I try never to speak on the behalf of the Indigenous people. Because you go, as they've said to us, you came here, you took our land, you took our children, now you want to take our stories. It's very difficult, but that doesn't mean I'm not aware of those problems and sensitive to those problems and want to see solutions to those problems. But I shouldn't speak on behalf of others. It's kind of an interesting thing. So, can I speak on behalf? Can I represent a woman on stage? Can I represent an Aboriginal on stage? And the answer is, I don't think I can. I don't think I should. I think those people should be taking the forum and representing themselves. But are there women in my improvisations? Yes. Do I describe them? Yes. Do I do that in a sexist way? Try not to. I think after kind of a good 40 years of thinking about feminism, I think I'm less sexist than I was before then. I was never particularly sexist. I always hated the way, in high school, I hated the way boys treated girls. So there was something already alert to it then. But, these are complex issues. And I think inherent in all art making is risk taking. In improvisation, for me, inherent in it is communication. Like the whole dynamic is partly I'm in the room to do whatever's going on inside my head, to present that as my art with the means that I have. But part of the reality is those people are there. I don't pretend the audience is not there. The audience is there. My communication with them is what turns everything that goes on inside my head into some kind of communicative form. My desire for people to understand what it is I'm thinking about or talking about, or what's attracting me, or where my attention is. And I don't just mean, this last bit sounds very language orientated, but I'm also quite movement orientated as well. But you're just dealing with all of that. The reality is you're in a room with people. Another one of my little kind of ways of, like I think we live in times when you go, should we be performing? Is this just kind of extreme narcissism? Is it just about showing off for an audience? I think if it was, I would have stopped a few years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. If it was just about that, it is partly about that, but it's not just about that. And the kind of rationale for me is that performing is an act of community. So at that moment, you and the audience are making a little community, and you are kind of the fire that we're all sitting around. And your job is to kind of somehow make that work for people. And if you're saying things that nobody likes, then they should leave, or they should boo, or they should they should certainly say, I'm not coming back and seeing this guy again. I think that's all fair enough. Courage to be an artist, it's always taken courage, you know, and that issue you're talking about, Neil, have the courage to reveal those things. But at the same time, we are in a social setting. That's why I've never done a shed.
Andrew, on that note,
can we all just go plop?
It feels like we could unfold so many areas around what you've presented today, and this could be a series of 3, 4, or 5 or 6 interviews with Andrew Morrish, the improvising God.
Oh,
but we do need to finish this morning, and thank you so much for being available. Thank you so much for the richness what you've offered this morning. I've come up with 3 words that start with I. One is integrity. I think you've brought integrity to this form and continue to do so. And the other 2 are insight and intelligence. The 3 I's that, and I think we can.
What about the 4th one, Kevin? Irritable bowel.
Look, I didn't want to publicly announce that, but you have, and well done. I think you mentioned the word courage before, and courageous. Well done, Andrew. Over to you, Neil.
It's hard to say anything after that. Boom. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Great. Keep the record on, Kevin, because pretend you've turned it off, and then we'll do the real. So much to talk about.
Andrew, you've been performing and practicing for well over 40 years. So I'm wondering if you could say something about how you've sustained yourself during that time.
The idea of sustainability for me is kind of ruled my assessment of my own, for want of a better word, career. You know, and as I said before, you know, 90% of my income came from teaching, 10% maybe from performing. But as part of that performing thing, also I was engaged in with some really enormous projects as an improviser. Kind of the most significant of those was the Urban Dream Capsule, which is Neil's project, which we did for a decade or so, and we 16 times. 4 of us, 3 of us our Wunder students, that's Nick Pappas and David Wiles and myself, and then Neil, living in a store window for up to 2 or 3 weeks at a time. We did that all around the world. It was a massive project. We got to perform for hundreds of thousands of people, and you got to perform exactly as much as you wanted to. It was kind of performer's dream, really, edging on torture in terms of all of that, performing while you're asleep as a concept, for instance. Very interesting and wonderfully helpful in terms of giving you a sense that you have a career that's kind of got different frames of reference. Most of my performing has been in studios with between 12 and 40 people, and I love that form. And then I went in, in the last decade or so, I've tried to find opportunities to go and work in places where there's lighting and maybe the potential to get audiences up to about 70 or 80. So most of it has been very small, not part of any kind of mainstream kind of frameworks, apart from the ones that existed from the teaching. So finding a way to sustain yourself is kind of important, and I think part of sustainability is having these kind of shifts in scale, not imagining that somehow the growth model, which is as you start here and then it gradually gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it either kills you or it's unmanageable, or you've got to employ 22 people to organize it for you. But for me, the sustainability thing is that's changing the scale, and those larger projects, Museum of Modern Oddities, I did that a few times in Zurich, and I was engaged with Nigel Calloway in Sydney in his opera project to be an improviser inside this kind of operatic piece that he made. All of these things add to the sense that what you're doing is sustainable. It's not just one thin line all the time. It goes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down. And that you sustain yourself through maintaining practice in that. You sustain, money's part of it. So if you don't get enough money, then it's unsustainable. But it's getting to that point where you don't have to think about money all the time was kind of my criteria. And it meant I never had a lot of money, but the living was quite straightforward. I wasn't, stuck in Viandi, Estonia with no money, wondering what I was going to do. It was never like that. And it was always really very gently sustainable. And I think that's something to think about in our practice, what that word sustainable means. For me, from the very beginning, sustainability is the model. It's not about growth in that kind of things, just needing to get bigger to get better. It's about maintaining yourself on something which has texture, and therefore you are stimulated by those shifts of texture, and that helps you to grow.